So he's also performed on this stage and various other stages that we've been a part of at Capital Bop. So it's exciting to have him here as a panelist to talk about his experiences. Rusty Hassan is a WPFW DJ and a longtime Washingtonian since his days in college at Georgetown in the 60s. He's taught jazz history at Georgetown, right? As well as GW?
No, American.
As well as American, sorry. And he's been an active part of the jazz scene for very long. He's also a contributor to a recent issue of Washington History magazine with a really great article on jazz radio. And he's a labor organizer, so he's got that perspective as well. So I guess I wanted to start us off talking about jazz's role in, to borrow a word from Steve Biko, conscientizing all of us here, but especially the three gentlemen to my left. Conscientizing you personally, how did specific artists or particular events in jazz history help you develop a critical attitude to the power structures in this country and the way that black artists are not necessarily always valued on their own terms? How did jazz sort of open your brain to things like that? Rusty, yeah, we can start over there.
Absolutely. As a kid growing up in Greenwich, Connecticut in the 50s and early 60s, I discovered jazz through the radio. But then I'd go out to stores to buy my albums. There was a Caldors in Greenwich that had a copy of We Insist, the Freedom Now suite. And I looked at it, I didn't have the money then. When I came back, it was gone. It took me many years to find a copy in Paris in 1969. But that's another story, because it was out of print. But shortly after I saw the album, I was messing around, 15, maybe not quite 16, with my parents' car, trying to figure out, I'm going to learn how to drive. And I had the radio on. And I'm flipping around on the dial. And I heard this panel discussion. Now, I'm already into jazz, but I heard this discussion with Charles Mingus, Max Roach, Abbie Lincoln. Nat Hentoff was moderating it, and there was this white critic who was really prominent. I can picture him. He was bald. He was very prominent writing liner notes. I'm having a senior moment on his name right now.
Ben Ratliff?
Huh?
Ben?
No, earlier. It's from the 50s on. He's still alive.
Mm-hmm.
Not Leonard Feather, but...
Phil Schaff?
No, Phil Schaff's too young.
Yeah.
But it'll kick in tonight. But they're talking about the music. We Insist, Freedom Now suite. Charles Mingus, Fables of Fathers. I think this was before he did Meditations on a Pair of Walks. There was also Meditations on Integration, that long piece with Eric Dolphy. And this white critic, and I know it wasn't Hentoff, and his name will kick in, was saying, well, you can't mix politics and art. You know, you can't do this. You know, and Mingus and Max and Abbie were all saying, this reflects our lives. This reflects our reality as black people in America. And that, to me, stuck with me. It was like, yeah, this is their lives, and this guy saying you can't mix politics and art. Well, you know, and so I got it, you know, in terms of perspective, you know, and so that was my start in terms of the political aspects of jazz. I, of course, went on to meet and interview Max Roach and Charles Mingus, and many years later, Max was still bitter about the attitude that the white establishment had in his music, and how it impacted his livelihood economically. And he still, you know, was still upset at this. This critic whose name will come to me at some point tonight. Fred.
I'm from Queens, New York, and I grew up in the 50s and 60s, like Rusty. And in my household, I lived in a working class neighborhood, and in my household, we listened to all kinds of music. We listened to Louis Armstrong and Mario Lanza and Ray Charles. Everyone listened to Ray Charles. If you didn't have the Ray Charles album, you know, and I ended up playing with Ray Charles. But I saw Louis Armstrong. He lived about 4 blocks from where I lived, and I saw him on the Ed Sullivan show one night. I must have been about 3 years old. And in my little mind, I knew that this guy was important. It was just something about the way he carried himself. And I knew he was a very important person. But the thought never occurred to me that it was jazz. I didn't know it was jazz. I didn't know it was, we used to listen to Mahalia Jackson. I didn't know that was gospel. There was no name for it.
It's black music.
But I knew that it was very important music. And I knew that it had a lot to do with black people. I mean, no one had to tell me. Instinctively I knew that. So it wasn't until later on, till the 60s, that I really felt this real division in the culture as expressed through the music. But it never occurred to me that it wasn't important. But it was important in such a way as it was like food or like air. It never occurred to me that it was a normal, natural thing to listen. Doesn't everybody do this? That kind of.
You know, it's interesting. In reflecting on the Black Lives Matter movement and in talking about jazz, one aspect of black music, it brings to mind how necessary it is to say that. The same reason why it's necessary to say Black Lives Matter, because it's evident that Black lives do not matter to the greater society. It's necessary also for people to say that jazz is black music, that rock and roll is black music, blues is black music, it's all black music. Every form of popular music that you can think of in America is black music. And in saying that, it empowers not only the black musicians, it empowers the people to sort of take a step back and look at what it is that you are doing in this music. Are you honoring where it came from? Are you honoring yourself in this music? Are you honoring who you are? Because this is talking, the story of black people in America and worldwide is a story of the liberation of yourself, the liberation of all people. All power to all people is the ultimate message. So in jazz, becoming conscientizing, using a Steve Biko quote, jazz has the power to do that, to, even if you're not necessarily a person who is well versed in the history of the music, well versed in the contemporary goings on of the music. Like Fred said, he could feel it. There's a feeling that's immediate in this music. It's a feeling of radical change within yourself, radical change within the musicians on the bandstand. It's a radical moment that we're experiencing when we experience this music. That's really the power of this music. Jazz is, just by default, by the nature of what it is, it's improvised music. Jazz is connecting to a tradition, even as it moves forward, as it innovates and changes, it's connected to this tradition of black music. And it has the power to liberate your mind and show you another way of thinking, another form of being, another form of consciousness, conscientizing. So that's what I said.
So in terms of all of that happening in the music and it moving along a spectrum, like you said, there's that tradition that always gets carried forward even as the developments occur. DC has been a real site of those changes. We've seen a lot of developments, innovations. Obviously, the standard knowledge is that Duke Ellington comes from here, and that Billy Taylor comes from here, and those people laid down a big standard for jazz history early on. But beyond that, even after the 1950s and 60s, when this became Chocolate City, became a majority black, thriving, black middle class town, the idea from the greater, social unconscious is that it sort of, the city declined after 1968, but really what happened to me is that in the 70s and 80s it became a hub of black nationalist thought, of Pan-Africanism, and of the music that's tied to that. So you had people like Chuck Brown, of course, like Gil Scott-Heron, like Fred Foss, so many people making music here on their own terms to a certain extent. And both you, Rusty, and you, Fred, were here for that time. So I'd love to hear anecdotes or stories about how the times played themselves out through the music. Maybe Fred, we can start with you.
Well, I can tell you that I can name 100 musicians in New York now. Mostly black, some white. And the one thing they all have in common is they all lived in D.C. at one point or another. And I don't know if people are really hip to this, but Fargo, I think Duke Ellington did an album called Fargo. And Fargo, we don't think of it as being like a real happening place, but it was a very, it was a very important place for musicians coming out of the Midwest, going to California. Fargo was like a scene. And DC has become a real hotbed for musicians coming from the South and the Midwest. DC is like a stopping off point. And I mean, I don't know if you know about that, but it really is. There are a lot of musicians that lived here. Ben West used to live here.
Right. Lester Young.
Right. Sonny Stitt lived here.
Yeah, let me pick some pivotal moments from the 60s. 1965, Nina Simone at DR Constitution Hall singing Mississippi Goddamn. John Coltrane playing at the Bohemian Caverns, doing things like Alabama. I saw Coltrane at the Caverns, I saw Nina at Constitution Hall. And then in the later 60s, musicians, coming through would come into town, like Jackie McLean would come down to perform for Left Bank Jazz Society, both here and in Baltimore. And so there was a consciousness, and I want to, when I met my wife, it was a difficult time for us because all of her friends were black nationalists. I just had come from Mississippi, where I met Mrs. Fannie Wilhamer, and she was working for the New Thing Art and Architecture Center, the jazz workshops at St. Margaret's Church, and all area musicians would perform there. And one of her closest friends that I had a difficult time at first was Gaston Neal. And Gaston was really impressed with the records that I had. So, he was looking at them. We finally hit it off. Became really close friends over the decades. And he was so important in terms of presenting artists like Sun Ra as part of the new school for Afro-American thought, or bringing down Pharoah Sanders to perform, and just as a presenter and part of the black art scene here in D.C. I'm really proud of the friendship that we developed. That had a rocky start, but became very close.
Yeah, let me just grab this. In terms of, I like the idea of those organizations working with the music, and the music working with those organizations, and there being sort of like a mingling of the efforts. And that's something that we're trying to, as Shannon mentioned, we're trying to remind people of. It's part of that history, and as we move, the music moves forward, the cause moves forward alongside it, and doing things like this where you come, you appreciate the music, you let it conscientize you, and you give some of your money to an amazing organization like Empower DC. That's what has happened through the history of this town. Fred, do you have memories of events like that, or of efforts where the music was entwined with organizations like that?
Bill Burrell had a
Oh,
place.
sure, DC Space.
DC Space.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, DC Space used to bring in.
Here, use this.
DC Space used to bring in summer
Oh, yeah, yeah.
and musicians that played that kind of music.
Yeah.
And I remember that place. Black music. Blue music. Where?
Oh, I mean, the club, one step down.
There was a place on 14th Street we were talking about earlier, Twins.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic place.
Yeah.
Unbelievable place on Colorado Avenue.
Right.
And they used to bring in everybody.
Let me,
Rogan Jar,
I mentioned the new thing.
Exactly.
Bigfoot.
And the director of it was a guy named Topper Carew, who later went on to make films. He did a film called DC Cad. But he would focus primarily on area artists. And they were a multifaceted arts organization. So they would have silkscreen posters by Lou Stovall and Lloyd McNeil. Lloyd McNeil was a flautist and artist who now is long been up in New York, who would play here in Washington. In fact, the show I did on WAMU in the 70s and through the 80s was an outgrowth of a new thing. It was called the New Thing New Music Show. And I started the show, but one of the earlier announcers was a percussionist from the New Thing. His name is Eric Lavat. And Eric had one of those great radio voices too. It was like when I come on behind him, it's like squealing almost. But, you know, Eric was part of the New Thing, who went on to work with McCoy Tyner and a host of editors. He was a drummer with Weather Report for a while. He was one of the important musicians who passed through, who, because of the economics of the music industry, left playing for a while. We played on the side, became a correctional officer. And I saw him when he came back with McCoy. He was playing at Blues Alley, and I said, well, why'd you do it? He said, I had a family to raise, you know, the money wasn't there, even though I was doing gigs with people like Weather Report. He said, now I got a pension and health insurance. You know, he's able to do the day gig like Buck Hill did here in Washington, D.C., working at the post office. Which gets to the economics of what musicians are confronted with as jazz musicians, and it's part of reflective of racism in America and other things, and how we deal with our society today, and what really needs to be done for the aging musical population, jazz musicians who are still doing gigs, not just because they want to, but because the money's here.
Yeah.
Now, all these stories really are really indicative. As a person who is admittedly, again, not from DC, same as Fred, these stories are really indicative of what kind of legacy is here in coming to the thought of DC as a site for jazz and black consciousness. When I first came here, going on 10 years ago, crazy. That was one of the first things that I noticed about DC, even though it was definitely in the stages and approaching some of the more advanced stages of gentrification in this city in 2005. It was still, comparatively speaking, from other places that I had been, a place where these stories were alive and thrived through people like Fred Foss and Rusty Hassan, all these people who have this historical memory of things that were going on back in these days, who had connections with some of the greats like Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, various other people, the various figures in the Pan-African movement, in the Garveyite movement, and the Black Panther Party, and the Republic of New Africa, as my bandmate was